As I recovered from my heart attack back in 2011, the 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 highest, biggest hurdle for me was anxiety. I had been prepared for depression. For lots of years, I'd been visiting people in the hospital after heart surgeries or heart attacks and various heart procedures. And one common theme was they nearly all experienced some measure of depression. And my cardiologist warned me of this. I was prepared for that. I mean, I wasn't looking forward to it, but I was prepared for the fact that depression is pretty much just a part of the picture. Well, I did experience some occasional depression, but not to the degree that I had kind of expected. But what took me by surprise was the anxiety and the anxiety attacks. They were debilitating. I'd heard about anxiety attacks, and I'd worked with very few people who had experienced anxiety attacks. It was mysterious to me. I wasn't quite where a lot of people are on anxiety, where they look at anxiety as a mental weakness or a weakness of constitution or just a weakness. But I did kind of think, okay, you have to get a grip and snap yourself out of it. Well, what I discovered in my own anxiety was it just doesn't work that way. I had a half dozen or so experiences where I couldn't get a grip on myself. And maybe somebody would look in at my life and that experience and say, well, no, it wasn't that you couldn't, it's that you didn't. Whatever, it didn't happen. And it was exhausting. It was excruciating, but it's not like somebody who's got a horrible wasting illness. It was just, and here's the other part about my anxiety attacks is they were temporary. They came on, they happened, and then they were over. At the root of anxiety is fear. You just don't have anxiety without fear. Now, I think you certainly can have fear without having anxiety attacks. But fear is at the heart of it. And I think for a lot of people, fear is the enemy. I'm not so sure that's true. I am going to talk about scripture from 1 John chapter 4 in just a few minutes, but it's worth making a little bunny trail expedition here to think about fear. What is the function of fear? Well, fear, how your brain picks it up and reacts to it and pushes it forward, is all about self-preservation. Fear, one of the primary things that fear does is that it escalates your systems and your senses. Now, I wish that fear always made my senses more keen and more able to discern and filter. No. What it does is it escalates my senses so that they become more sensitive to everything. And not everything. One of the things that they become less sensitive to is activity here in the prefrontal cortex of my brain, which is where the executive command resides in the brain. There is a term, in fact, that a lot of neuropsychologists use called amygdala hijacking. And what that basically means is that the part of your brain that registers fear and reacts to it overtakes the part of your brain that is able to think and filter and judge the relative value or intensity of the threat. Well, there are a lot of times when that doesn't happen well. And that's essentially what an anxiety attack does. It just that hijacking effect just whirls. Oh, by the way, it also happens when if you're in a relationship, when you get really angry and you just get into this spinning fight, a verbal fight with another, or even at times physical fights I've known of. So it really is essentially the same thing. It's that hijacking of the prefrontal cortex. So the role of fear is to set you up so you can react to threat. Now, the difference between reacting and responding is conscious thought. Fear doesn't set you up to respond well, because that takes conscious thought. And what fear does is it bypasses thought right to instinct to set you up to react to threat. It is a gift. It's a gift from God for self-preservation. But boy, the enemy can bend it and distort it. He can use it in so many ways. Well, so that brings us now to what John the Apostle wrote in 1 John chapter 4, beginning in verse 18. It probably would be good to go back to verse 17, what we talked about last time, and make sure that we get it set in its context. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. I love that idea. In this world, we are like Jesus. And then he jumps quickly. It's almost like there's no transition. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Let's start with what this doesn't say. What this doesn't say is, if you are walking with God, if your life is conforming to the shape of what John said, we in this world, we're like Jesus. The more you become like Jesus, you're not going to be afraid of anything ever. I don't believe that's what I know that's not what it's saying. He's talking about fear. There is a specific kind of fear that John is talking about. He says, there is no fear in love. Love and fear are mutually exclusive. Okay, that's true. Real love, mature love, deepening love crowds out fear. You see, fear is often, not always, but often irrational. And what fear can do is it can overwhelm these irrational fears. But think about I wonder what the specific fear, is there a specific fear that John's talking about, or is there a category of fear that John's talking about? I think there is. I think that's why it seems like there's no transition here between verses 17 and 18. See, remember that in verse 17 he says, we will have confidence on the day of judgment. And this is how, that in this world we are like Jesus. We're most like Jesus as we learn to and as we practice loving as he did. And on the day of judgment, this is what will give us confidence. Right? What's the opposite of confidence? Fear. Is it possible that John is saying, we do not have to fear judgment? Perfect love, in fact, there is no fear in love. Those again, they're mutually exclusive. As I love God and as I permit him to love me, fear is marginalized, and a particular kind of fear, the fear of judgment. We have to pause and just take a look at how broad that fear is and how deep it is in many of our lives. Now, there's all kinds of judgment in the world. There is the judgment that I feel from a neighbor because my lawn needs to be mowed and I just haven't done it. There's the judgment that I might feel from when I was a student. I make a poor grade on an exam and I feel judged by the teacher and anybody who sees that D on my paper. There's that judgment. There's a judgment that an estranged husband and an estranged wife apply to each other. There's that. There's legal judgment. And then there is ultimately a day of judgment, a judgment day. And of all the forms and moments of judgment, that's most significant, the most serious, and for a lot of people, most frightening. I don't know how many revival sermons have been preached, and the tagline, the punchline is, you're going to stand before God at the judgment. Are you ready? Well, that ought to put some fear into a lot of people. If it is true that in one moment we will face God's judgment, then we ought to be, really, if it's all about just my own capabilities and my own good works and my own righteousness, my own rightness, I better be afraid, because I'm not going to make it on that basis. And neither are you. And you're probably a lot better than me. Well, here John says, don't lose this. There is no fear in love. And then he goes on and he fleshes it out some more. But perfect love drives out fear. Okay. Perfect love. For me, it took me a while to realize that when John classifies this as perfect love, he's talking about one specific kind of love. There is only one kind of love that is perfect. Only God's love is perfect. See, only God can love perfectly because only God is perfect. I mean, you just go back from one idea to the next until you hit the root, the perfection of God. It sets up this perfect love. I'm unable to love my wife perfectly. I love her deeply and I love her a lot, but I can't love her perfectly because I'm not perfect. God's love is perfect. And here John says, perfect love drives out fear. The old King James Version of the Bible phrases this, perfect love casts out fear. Well, it's the same idea. It throws it out. It drives it out. You see, perfect love leaves no room for this fear of judgment. I feel it's important that believers realize when we're talking about this love-fear dichotomy, we're not talking about every kind of fear. We're not talking about just garden variety fear or even the fear of some drastic human thing, right? We're specifically talking about what this perfect love does is it drives out my fear of facing God. Well, there's more to think about, more to talk about on this, but my time's up. So I'm going to close, and we'll come back to this again next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.